In the year 1095, Europe stood on the edge of transformation. A continent scarred by famine, violence, and endless feudal wars seemed an unlikely stage for a movement that would shake the world. Lords fought neighbors for castles, knights pillaged peasants, and kings struggled to hold fragile thrones. Yet in the midst of this fractured landscape, a new vision began to take root, one that promised both salvation and glory. It was not born in a battlefield, but in a council chamber at Clermont, where Pope Urban II rose before a crowd of nobles and clergy, his voice echoing with fervor. He spoke of a distant land, of Christian pilgrims harassed, of holy places defiled, of the great city of Jerusalem under the dominion of the Seljuk Turks. Urban's words struck deeper than a sermon. He cast the struggle not as a mere war, but as a divine summons. "Take up the cross," he proclaimed, "and march east to free the sepulchre of Christ." To those who fought, he promised remission of sins, absolution for a lifetime of wrongs. In that moment, the endless cycles of petty feudal strife seemed to pale before a cosmic purpose. The cry of "Deus vult, God wills it," rose from the assembly like thunder. It spread like fire across Europe. In villages, castles, and monasteries, men and women embraced the cause. Knights stitched crosses to their tunics. Peasants carved crude symbols into their garments. Bishops urged their flocks forward. For the first time, Europe's warriors saw a chance to turn their swords away from each other and toward a single holy enemy. Yet the call drew not only the noble, but the desperate. Entire communities prepared to march east, some seeking forgiveness, others seeking plunder, many driven by both. Thus began the greatest migration of armed men since the days of Rome. A movement that would carry princes, paupers, zealots, and opportunists across thousands of miles into lands they scarcely knew, bound by faith, fear, and ambition. The First Crusade had been born, and already it was larger than the will of any single man. Before kings and lords could organize, the wave of popular zeal broke loose. In the spring of 1096, a ragtag host of peasants, monks, and low-born knights assembled under the preaching of Peter the Hermit, a wiry, fire-eyed figure whose charisma moved crowds to tears. They called themselves the Army of God, though few had armor, fewer had money, and almost none had discipline. Carrying crude crosses and makeshift weapons, they surged eastward long before the princes had gathered their banners. The People's Crusade was less an army than a tide. Along the Rhine and Danube they marched, swelling in number, but also in chaos. Driven by fervor, some turned their rage against Jewish communities along the way, unleashing massacres that stained the crusading cause with blood before it even reached the Holy Land. When they crossed into Hungary and the Balkans, hunger and disorder turned them into marauders, and local rulers often met them with sword and fire. Yet they pressed onward, believing God's hand guided their path. At last, they reached Constantinople, the great Byzantine capital. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who had hoped for disciplined knights to aid him against the Turks, found instead an unruly horde camped outside his walls. He ferried them quickly across the Bosporus into Anatolia, hoping to be rid of them. But zeal without order met only disaster. Near Civito, the Seljuks descended upon the People's Crusade, surrounding them, slaughtering them almost to the last. Fields were left strewn with the bodies of peasants who had dreamed of Jerusalem but never left Anatolia. The People's Crusade ended as swiftly as it began, a tragic prelude to the true armies still gathering in the West. Its failure, however, revealed both the peril of blind zeal and the depth of passion that the cross now commanded in Europe. As the wreckage of the People's Crusade smoldered, the true leaders of the movement prepared their armies. Unlike the ragged bands of peasants, these were great princes and seasoned warriors, men whose names carried weight across Europe. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, a pious and disciplined knight. Raymond of Toulouse, old, wealthy, and stubbornly proud. Bohemond of Taranto, the cunning Norman son of a southern Italian adventurer. Hugh of Vermandois, brother of the King of France, though vain and arrogant. Robert of Normandy, restless heir to the legacy of William the Conqueror, and Baldwin, Godfrey's ambitious brother. They were rivals as much as allies, each dreaming of glory, land, or divine reward, yet all bound themselves to the cross. Their knights and retainers formed the backbone of the First Crusade. Thousands of heavily armed horsemen, countless foot soldiers, and camp followers marched with them, creating a force unprecedented in medieval Christendom. Their path eastward was long and perilous. Through Hungary and the Balkans they trudged, enduring suspicion and hardship. Some armies fought skirmishes with locals, others strained relations with the Byzantine Empire. Yet by 1097, wave after wave of Crusader hosts had converged on Constantinople. Emperor Alexios, wary of their ambition, sought oaths of fealty from the princes, demanding they restore captured lands to Byzantine rule. Some swore reluctantly, others evaded, but all knew they needed the emperor's aid. For only with his ships could they cross into Asia Minor, and only with his supplies could they hope to survive the long campaign ahead. Thus, the princes found themselves bound uneasily to Byzantium, stepping into a world where East and West, Greek and Latin, Christian and Muslim would clash with unrelenting ferocity. The Crusade had at last taken shape as a true army, and its gaze turned toward the heart of Anatolia, where the Seljuks awaited. The march through Anatolia was a crucible. The Seljuk Turks, masters of swift cavalry and desert war, sought to wear down the lumbering Crusader host. But the Crusaders, though ill-prepared for the burning sun and harsh terrain, proved more resilient than expected. At Nicaea in 1097, the first major test came. The city, strong and well-defended, blocked the road east. Crusader siege engines battered its walls, while Byzantine ships cut off its lake supply. After weeks of fierce resistance, the defenders surrendered, not to the Crusaders but to the Byzantines, who secretly negotiated the city's handover. The Crusaders were furious, feeling cheated of plunder, yet they pressed on. Soon after, at Dorylaeum, the Seljuks struck with all their fury. Kilij Arslan, the Seljuk Sultan, hurled his cavalry at the divided Crusader columns. Arrows darkened the sky, horsemen encircled them, and for hours it seemed the Crusaders might be annihilated like the People's Crusade before them. Yet discipline held. Knights formed tight circles, shields raised, while messengers sped to summon reinforcements. By midday, fresh Crusader forces crashed into the Turkish flank, turning the tide. Kilij Arslan's army broke, leaving the Crusaders bloodied but victorious. The road east lay open, but it was a road of hardship. Under blistering heat, across barren plains, men collapsed from thirst, horses died, and supply lines faltered. Yet slowly, painfully, the Crusaders advanced, driven onward by the promise of Jerusalem and the glory of God. Each step carried them deeper into lands alien to them, lands where their faith and endurance would be tested to the very limit. Beyond the deserts and mountains lay Antioch, one of the great cities of the Levant, commanding the road to Jerusalem. To take it was essential. To fail was to doom the crusade. In October 1097, the Crusaders laid siege to its colossal walls so massive they dwarfed any fortress in Europe. Months dragged on, winter set in, and starvation gnawed at the army. Horses were eaten, leather boiled for food, men deserted. The defenders, reinforced by Turkish and Arab allies, sallied forth in sudden raids, harassing the besiegers. Yet the Crusaders endured, tightening their grip, building siege towers, and cutting supply routes. By the spring of 1098, despair threatened to break the host. And then fortune shifted. Bohemond, ever cunning, struck a secret bargain with a traitor inside the city. Under cover of night, Crusader troops scaled the walls, opening gates for their comrades. Antioch fell, and the city that had defied them for months lay at last in their hands. But victory turned swiftly to peril. Almost immediately, a vast Muslim army under Kerboga of Mosul descended upon Antioch, surrounding the Crusaders within the very city they had just taken. Now besiegers became the besieged. Starvation and disease returned, morale withered, and many despaired that all was lost. It was then that a miracle was proclaimed. A priest claimed to have discovered the Holy Lance, the very spear that had pierced Christ's side, buried beneath a church. Whether relic or fabrication, its effect was electrifying. The Crusaders' spirits soared, and with desperate faith they marched out against Kerboga's vastly larger host. In a battle as astonishing as it was brutal, The Crusaders shattered the enemy, driving them from the field. Against all odds, Antioch was theirs, and the road to Jerusalem lay open. The victory at Antioch did not bring unity. The princes quarreled bitterly over spoils and titles. Bohemond claimed Antioch for himself, defying promises to the Byzantines, while others pressed onward. Rivalries deepened, yet the greater goal of Jerusalem still beckoned. At last, in the summer of 1099, after years of hunger, disease, and endless battles, the Crusaders approached the Holy City. Jerusalem, sacred to three faiths, stood atop its hills, its walls daunting, its defenders resolute. For the Crusaders, it was the culmination of everything: the penance of their sins, the toil of their march, the will of God. The siege began in June. Wood for siege towers had to be hauled from miles away, and water was scarce under the blazing sun. Yet the army labored with relentless purpose, driven by a vision of redemption. On July 15th, after weeks of preparation, they launched their final assault. A great wooden tower, dragged against the northern walls, gave Godfrey of Bouillon's men a path upward. Fighting with ferocity beyond reckoning, they scaled the battlements, cutting down defenders, forcing open the gates. The Crusaders poured into the city. What followed was slaughter. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were cut down, holy places desecrated in blood, the air filled with the cries of the dying. Chroniclers spoke of streets running red, of corpses piled high in sacred courts. Yet for the Crusaders, it was triumph. After 3 years of unimaginable hardship, they had taken Jerusalem. In the aftermath, Godfrey of Bouillon was chosen not as king but as defender of the Holy Sepulchre, refusing a crown of gold where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. A new Latin kingdom was born, fragile and small, but for a moment it seemed a victory ordained by heaven itself. The First Crusade had begun as a call from a pope and ended with Christian banners flying over Jerusalem. It had seen peasants march to their doom, princes carve out realms, and an army of Europe accomplish what seemed impossible. Yet the cost was staggering: countless lives lost, ancient cities ravaged, communities destroyed. The Crusaders had claimed victory, but it was one steeped in blood. For Europe, the Crusade ignited a new age. Pilgrimage and holy war were fused together, faith and violence entwined in a way that would shape centuries. For the Byzantine Empire, it brought both relief and betrayal, allies who became rivals, and the seeds of future discord. For the Islamic world, it was a catastrophe, a shocking loss of Jerusalem that would stir new leaders and new campaigns of resistance. The Crusaders, though few in number, had carved out a foothold in the East. But their triumph would not go uncontested. In the years to come, their fragile kingdoms would face relentless attack, and the memory of conquest would burn in the minds of their enemies. The First Crusade had ended, but the crusading age had only just begun, and so the tale closes, with the echoes of Deus Vult still reverberating across time, the holy war for Jerusalem etched into history as both triumph and tragedy, faith and fury bound forever in the story of the First Crusade. When Louis VII and Eleanor of Aquitaine arrived in the East, their journey was already marked by exhaustion, mistrust, and simmering tensions. Yet it was in Antioch, the proud principality founded by Crusaders half a century earlier, that their personal struggles erupted into open conflict. Antioch's ruler was Raymond of Poitiers, Eleanor's uncle, a man of charm, courage, and cunning. He welcomed the French king and queen with lavish feasts, and Eleanor, whose restless ambition had long sought greater purpose, found in her uncle a kindred spirit. Raymond urged Louis to abandon the proposed march on Jerusalem and instead join him in an offensive against Aleppo, the heartland of Nur ad-Din's power. Strategically, it made sense. Aleppo was the true enemy, the city whose fall could cripple Muslim resistance. Yet Louis, pious and stubborn, saw his vow to reach Jerusalem as sacred. Eleanor, impatient with her husband's rigid devotion and inspired by Raymond's vision, openly supported her uncle's plan. Whispers spread through Antioch that the queen cared more for her uncle's company than her husband's cause. Some chroniclers, unfriendly to Eleanor, painted her loyalty as scandal, hinting at impropriety. Whether truth or slander, the rumors widened the rift between king and queen. Louis, enraged by Eleanor's defiance, chose to leave Antioch under cover of night, dragging his unwilling wife with him. For Eleanor, this was a humiliation she never forgave. The marriage, already strained, began its slow collapse. Within 2 decades it would be annulled, and Eleanor would remarry, this time to Henry of Anjou, soon to become Henry II of England. Through her, the Angevin Empire would be born, and with it, one of the greatest rivalries of the Middle Ages. Thus, the failure of the Crusade not only shaped the fate of Jerusalem, but altered the dynastic map of Europe itself. Back in the Holy Land, the political fractures deepened. The Crusaders' decision to target Damascus instead of Aleppo baffled many. Damascus had been, at times, an ally of the Kingdom of Jerusalem against Zengi's heirs. By turning their swords against it, the Crusaders drove the city into Nur ad-Din's arms. The siege, brief and disastrous, transformed potential allies into enemies and squandered what little trust remained between East and West. When the retreat was ordered, the shame was palpable. Knights who had once believed themselves chosen instruments of God trudged back in defeat, their banners tattered, their hopes broken. The aftermath in Europe was no less grim. Louis VII returned to France, his prestige shattered. The nobles who had followed him spoke bitterly of wasted lives and empty promises. Eleanor's resentment hardened into resolve. Her marriage to Louis was now little more than a political husk. Conrad III, though welcomed home with courtesy, found his authority weakened. His Hohenstaufen dynasty would soon face bitter struggles with the papacy and with rivals in Germany. Bernard of Clairvaux, once hailed as the voice of God's will, became the lightning rod for blame. He had promised victory, assured kings and peasants alike that God would bless their endeavor. And yet the crusade had ended in humiliation. Letters of reproach poured in, and even his allies whispered doubts. Bernard, heartbroken, defended himself with eloquence, claiming that human sinfulness had turned God's favor away. He died a few years later, his reputation scarred. Though later canonized, in his own lifetime he bore the weight of failure. In the East, however, the Crusade's collapse reshaped the balance of power. Nur ad-Din's prestige soared. Damascus, once hesitant, now allied firmly with Aleppo. The dream of uniting Syria under a single Muslim ruler was closer to reality than ever before. This new unity created a platform for even greater ambitions, to strike not only at Antioch and Edessa, but eventually at Jerusalem itself. The Christians of the East, weakened and isolated, clung to survival. Their hopes of massive reinforcements from Europe had been dashed. No new kings would come soon. The Second Crusade thus stands not only as a failed campaign, but as a turning point. It revealed the fragility of Crusader unity, the dangers of personal rivalries, and the growing strength of the Islamic counteroffensive. It exposed the tensions between Byzantium and the West, the mistrust that would in time erupt into outright hostility, and it left behind personal consequences that rippled across Europe, the collapse of a royal marriage, the reshaping of dynasties, and the lingering disillusionment of a generation that had believed itself chosen to do God's work, only to return defeated. Yet history is often shaped as much by failure as by triumph. The failure at Damascus gave Nur ad-Din the legitimacy he needed to build his power. From his foundations, Saladin would rise, a man who would in time command the loyalty of Egypt and Syria, and who would confront Christendom in battles that dwarfed those of the Second Crusade. The humiliation of Louis and Conrad ensured that when the next crusade came, it would be led not merely by kings, but by figures of legendary stature: Richard the Lionheart, Philip Augustus, and Frederick Barbarossa. The echoes of the Second Crusade would resound into that greater struggle, the clash of titans for the fate of Jerusalem. The Second Crusade began with fire and ended in ashes. It began with the thunder of Bernard's voice in the cathedrals of Europe, with kings kneeling to take the cross, with the promise of redemption and victory. It ended with broken armies, abandoned sieges, and the bitter taste of defeat. It revealed that the crusading dream was fragile, that unity was fleeting, and that faith alone could not overcome discord and poor strategy. And yet, even in failure, it set the stage for the next great chapter of the medieval holy wars. where Cross and Crescent would clash again with even greater fury. Thus, the story of the Second Crusade lingers, not as a tale of triumph, but as a lesson in the cost of pride, the dangers of division, and the resilience of those who fight to defend their lands. It is a reminder that history is written not only in victories, but in defeats that reshape the world just as profoundly. From the ashes of Damascus rose the storms of the future, and in those storms, the fate of East and West would be decided anew.